Welcome everyone, I'm Philippa Jeffries and I'm here with Hans-Christian Rudolph, also from Cybersecurity Magazine, and Edgar Weippl, Research Director of SBA Research and Professor at the University of Vienna. And today we're discussing security for production systems engineering and also the ARIS conference that Edgar is organising. So welcome both of you. So Edgar, I guess starting with your research in particular on security for production systems engineering. I guess to begin the conversation, what are your thoughts on how the way we approach security for production systems has developed recently, especially I guess with the rollout of 5G and Internet of Things and so on?
So production systems, they have a long history of being really good in terms of safety. And since those systems are usually rather old and they have a long lifespan of actively being used, some of the progress that has been made in IT security has not yet shown up in production systems. And it's also only been recently that the IT component in production systems and in production systems engineering has become more important. So there's some catching up that people need to do if you compare this to security technologies that we have on PCs or also on mobile devices. Luckily, today we don't see so many attacks on production systems yet, so there's time to actually implement those solutions.
Okay, why do you think that is then, that they're not being targeted at all? Or as much?
Yeah, some I guess are specifically targeted. There have been media reports on that, but there's also it's much harder to exploit production systems because they're more diverse. So attacking a Windows PC or a Mac is easier because they're basically all the same. So if you have an attack that works on one system, it works on thousands of other systems. For production systems, the attacks have to be specifically tailored, and standard attacks are not as easily feasible. And they don't scale that well. So you probably see a fair amount of really targeted attacks, but the kind of widespread attacks are not that common yet.
Okay, and I mean, probably a question open to both of you. Do you think there will be an increase in attacks for production systems?
Yes, and in particular, we think that the engineering process, so when you build and design those systems, has to be secured more, because finding a vulnerability in an existing system is always hard. It's much easier if you can breach the design phase and you can put weaknesses, vulnerabilities into the system during the design phase, because then you know where you put them, and it's obviously then very easy to exploit. And in addition, the systems used for engineering are also more standardized. So even if you build different industrial plants, be it a power plant or a steel mill, you use similar tools to plan and engineer those. So if you exploit those vulnerabilities in those systems and exploit the design process that you introduce vulnerabilities in the design, it's just much easier. And that's, I think, a good approach for attackers to make money with ransomware, for instance.
And I would assume with, as you mentioned, OT or production systems and IT growing more and more together, the
Yes.
ease of exploitation, or let's say the entry barrier for attackers will lower further as well. Philippa, you mentioned 5G in the beginning. I would assume a lot of old systems, old production systems that are still out there rely on security by air gap or simply not being connected to public networks. But I would assume as an outsider that plays a role as well, right?
Yes, with 5G and direct connectivity of components and systems being introduced so that certain machines or components communicate directly to cloud-based services for statistics or preemptive maintenance. There are also now direct connections to the outside world, and that don't go through the typical network protection mechanisms that are in place in today's system. So if your machine directly communicates, for instance, via 5G with a cloud provider, then this is also a potential vulnerability.
And that essentially leads us on to the security challenges that production systems are faced with. I mean, in the end, it usually boils down to violation of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. You mentioned safety as well, which has a little bit of a different angle to it. But in your view, what are some of the key challenges that production systems are faced?
So what makes it a bit different to, for instance, security on mobile devices is that you design a production system to run for many years. You know, cell phone, maybe 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years. But if you build a ship or a steel mill, that's maybe for 30 years, 40 years. So this is one major difference, that also today we have very old systems that still work well, and today's system that we plan will hopefully also work for 30, 40 years. This is one major difference, and the second major difference is that updates are somewhat harder. It's either there are also legal restrictions to whether you can easily update things, or you don't have so many test opportunities because plants are more different, and so if it works in one, you can't be sure that it works in another, and kind of doing an over-the-air update for some huge machine, and then you just hope that it still continues working after the update. It seems somewhat risky, so the update strategies are different. Those are, I guess, the major differences to traditional IT security that we know, and that also make it harder, because basically today with PCs or mobile devices, we say, well, if there's a vulnerability, we'll just install the updates and then it will be fixed. And we can do this even on a daily basis.
Okay, and is this true generally for all kinds of production systems, or are there particular ones that face more challenges or different types of challenges, or are particularly exposed?
The major challenge here is also the differences is how safety critical are those systems. So big production systems, for instance, if you produce steel, so there's also a huge safety component to that, because in the past people mainly worried about safety, but they do recognize now that we need IT security to ensure safety. So if there's if certain systems are not available, so if traditional security problem is requirement is availability, if availability is cannot be guaranteed, then this also has safety issues. For instance, some safety systems that should put the entire production system in a safe state. If those are not available, then this clearly is a safety issue. And this is also something that people without IT background, with an engineering background, now start to realize that because traditionally electrical engineers or people who designed those systems know and have a lot of experience with safety. Otherwise, you can't build those huge systems, and not so much with IT security. And they say, well, a violation of confidentiality is not that bad. No one dies because of that. But IT security is important for safety also.
Okay, so do you think there's like a change in attitudes?
Yes, and we've seen this in the past, for instance, in the automotive industry. Maybe 10 years ago, no one worried about IT security. Then there were some spectacular exploits on cars, and now the entire automotive industry realized that this is important, and they now invest a lot and have also in the last 10 years really progressed in terms of making cars secure in the terms of the IT systems that they have. They always had a long history in safety, so that's maybe comparable. And again, the difference is cars. Yeah, maybe a car is 5 years old, 10 years old, maybe 15 years old, but the average car that the consumer drives is not 50 or 60 years old. I mean, obviously they're old timers, but
Okay.
Yeah, and you see this with some of the cars on the road these days. It sometimes seems like you buy a Tesla and it's never really finished. Or
and you get all the air updates.
Exactly. Insert any other car company. I'm not sure. But you just read a lot of these stories where over-the-air updates are continually being rolled out because there's some new functionality or weakness being discovered.
Yes, and also additional functionality is added. So this car has a lot of sensors, and with new software updates, you can have new functions without building into the car new hardware. So with all the sensors, maybe you can get a better assistance system to driving that some companies call autopilot, even though it doesn't really. You shouldn't trust it and let it drive alone. They do say it, but they still use the name autopilot for it. And with all the sensors that you've got, you can then add functions such as detecting rain, even if you don't have a specific system that detects rain through the visual cameras. For instance, you can detect rain and then add functionality of windscreen wipers or so, and kind of just through software updates increase functionality that in the past you could only add by adding new hardware. And I guess we see similar things in production industry in future.
Right. I quickly wanted to go back to one of the points you mentioned earlier, which is crucial in the mobile industry as well, and that is standardization. Maybe on the contrary, not looking for the particular issues, but are there particular industries that are doing exceptionally well or have been, spearheading the standardization efforts in the security area?
Now there's standardization efforts also driven from the safety perspective, and the industry that we used to work with and that we also continue working with, steel industry, they are very aware of safety issues and invest a lot in IT security for safety reasons, because I'm not an engineer, but basically metal is hot and liquid and therefore like really dangerous if things go wrong, and you cannot shut off those systems easily, otherwise the entire hardware is broken, because if you shut off the an oven and the metal gets cold again, then basically the entire thing is broken and it costs millions. So they invest a lot now in IT security. And power plants and electric grids have realized in the past maybe 5 years or so that they are obviously a critical infrastructure, and that IT security is important. And there have been incidents in some countries where targeted attacks, probably from state actors, have brought down the electric grid, at least for a couple of days. So they're very conscious of the risks that exist.
Yeah, and kind of beyond looking at attitudes and standardization, my question is, how would you like the industry to progress or to improve in this area?
So the first, I think they're already achieving the first step, that is being aware of IT security problems, and recognizing that software is everywhere today. So even hardware devices are usually controlled by some firmware that is executed within those components, and thus it's software. And then you put all those pieces together and it's complex systems that interact. So basically, I mean, there's still obviously a lot of hardware engineering needed that those things work, but every company today is a software company. Either they develop the software themselves or they put together software components to form a more complex system. So automotive industry has recognized this, that it's basically computers on wheels that they produce. And I guess we see this in future also for other industries. So they, if you build a ship today, this also has a lot of IT components, and with autonomous navigation systems that optimize also fuel consumption on predicting arrival times and taking weather into account. There are again so many interfaces that those systems now have that it becomes more complex. So this is, I think, very important. And the second thing that we're also working on is that you not only focus on creating a secure product, but that you, similar to what the software industry did, is introducing a secure software development lifecycle, is introducing a secure engineering process, so that you make sure that the engineering that goes through many steps, and you have tools used by different experts in building such a complex system that you're actually aware of which version of the tool you use. It could be simply errors in the tools used that produce wrong output, and you have to know if those errors are detected, which components you have to now check because of the faulty tools, or it could be security vulnerabilities in those tools that are exploited. So similar to the software industries that secures its build process, you also have to secure the engineering process. In particular, today, where people collaborate in different countries, more and better electronic exchange of certain parts of the engineering artifacts becomes commonplace, because in the past, one engineer designed something, created a PDF, sent it to some other person, they entered this thing into their tool, and there was some kind of manual checking. And if something kind of looks strange, he would pick up the phone and call his colleague and say, is this correct? It kind of looks different to what we usually see that you designed. And those steps are now streamlined and done more automatically, and thus a lot of those human sanity checks are no longer available. So this is important that people realize this.
Yeah, and I guess that isn't just true for production systems either. That's generally across the board.
Yes, other industries have the same problem, but they, for instance, financial industry realized this many years ago. I mean, if you look at fraud detection in banks, I mean, obviously they spend a lot, and they do really good jobs in detecting anomalies, which we, in this level of expertise and support, we don't see this in production systems engineering yet.
Okay.
Another issue that also essentially every industry faces these days is obviously finding skilled resources and enough of that in order to fill security and software development processes. And particularly, I would assume, in this sector, since it's a very specialized technology, it's not usually something that you extensively discuss in your computer science degree. How does the industry cope with that?
Yes, I think this is a challenge. But as I said, companies need to realize, and are slowly also realizing, that they are at least partly software companies. So they also need to hire computer science people. And hopefully everyone who studies computer science at least has a basic knowledge of IT security. And things that we've seen, so it's well documented in the automotive industry through research papers, what some of the security problems were in the past. And if you look at it from a computer science perspective, you cannot really imagine that those large companies made those mistakes. So for instance, several years ago, there was one large automotive company that allowed over-the-air updates of the firmware of their cars, and this was unsigned code. So basically everyone who could send code to the car could simply update the firmware of the car. Something that, I don't know, Microsoft did, I don't know, 20 years ago, so that the operating system does not install unsigned code. Even people who write malware and who operate botnets don't sign their updates so that they don't lose control of the botnet. So something that in operating systems has been around for like 20 years or so, those mistakes have been made. Or other examples of things that we've seen in the automotive industry is that cryptographic keys, that the same cryptographic key is used for all cars that they manufacture, and that they are not at all protected. So if you have access to one car and you read out this cryptographic key, you can reuse the same cryptographic key for all other cars. Yeah? Things that no one who takes an introductory class in IT security and passes it, hopefully, would do. Yeah. And now, if you look at those companies hiring people, they hire massive amounts of computer security people, and now things really changed. If you look at the modern cars of the last 2-3 years, this has become much better. And I guess the same thing we'll see in production systems. Yes, and because you mentioned it's hard finding people, and one thing that also changes in this industry is that people no longer stay at one company for the entire working life. So in the past, you joined an engineering company in Germany at the age of, maybe if you went to university, maybe at the age of 25, or if you did an apprenticeship, you actually joined it at the age of 15, and you basically stayed there 30 years or 40 years. And you knew all other people very well, and there was a lot of informal communication. And if you saw something weird in the design, you knew whom to call, and those things change. So teams, as I mentioned, are now more internationally distributed. People don't stay so long in a company, so they don't have this informal network. They don't know how their colleague works. And it gets rid of some of the, it makes engineering obviously more efficient, but on the other hand, it gets rid of some of the sanity checks that humans do. So that's something that companies need to realize also.
Definitely. I'm afraid we're coming towards the end of our time now, but I just want to finish by talking about the conference. So the ARIS conference this August, the International Conference on Availability, Reliability and Security. This is focusing on dependability this year, I believe. I was wondering, just you could talk a bit about that and how that kind of links to your research and what we've been talking about today.
Yes, we've been over the last years always trying to put those two communities of dependability and security together so that they talk more. There's some requirements that are similar in both communities. For instance, the requirement of availability is such a requirement. And because we think that as digitalization becomes even more important in production systems, joining those two communities, or at least offering a point of exchange for those communities, is important. And so we hope to attract, and we've seen some of the reviews and papers now that researchers from both communities come here and publish jointly. The challenge here is always getting the reviews. So some of the things that are kind of new for the dependability community might sound trivial for the security community, and reviewers might say, well, that's kind of obvious. This is not a new research contribution. And the same in the vice versa. But yeah, that's the challenge of organizing such a conference.
Just briefly, if our listeners wanna learn more about the conference, where should they go?
So there's the ARIS conference website. If you Google for ARIS conference, you'll find it at aris-conference.eu. And for the full scientific papers, the deadline is already passed, but there are also workshops, and we also have a EU symposium where the idea is that EU projects usually need some dissemination activities, and we established ARIS as a meeting point for security and dependability projects. that they meet once a year. So the advantage for EU projects is that they don't have to take care of the local organization, that there's a room and that there's, if they want to publish proceedings, that is easily done within the ARES framework. And the advantage is also if you have different projects co-located at the same time, that there's more exchange. So this is something that in the short term you can do, and obviously there's the next conference. This year's conference is a virtual conference, unfortunately. So there's unfortunately the important and really nice part of social activities won't take place, but next year we'll be in Dublin, and I hope that we can again then meet in person and enjoy not only the scientific presentations, but also the other activities.
Okay, well, thank you both for joining me today. Edgar, especially, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Edgar.